We can now bring in David Lees, Associate Professor of French Studies at the University of Warwick. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for speaking to us here on France 24. Why did it take France so long to recognize the contributions of soldiers from its former colonies?
Well, good afternoon. I think this is really largely a question of the legacy of colonialism, really, when it comes to the French context. As you've been saying, and as Emmanuel Macron has been announcing today, many of the Free French forces who were involved in Operation Dragoon came from either North Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa, and these were people who were themselves subjects of the French colonial power. And given the often bloody wars of decolonization that took place during the 1950s and 1960s, including most notably the war in Algeria to give Algeria independence, though the kind of legacy of these soldiers has been generally overlooked. And it's also, as you've been noting, this invasion, which was quite a significant invasion force involving thousands of Free French forces, as well as American and US British forces who invaded Provence to liberate the south of France 80 years ago today. This invasion as a whole has tended to be overlooked and overshadowed by the D-Day commemorations, 80 years, of course, since D-Day in June of this year. So it's a combination, I think, of the ongoing legacy of the French colonial projects and the kind of wars of decolonization, but also the way in which this operation as a whole has tended to be overlooked, particularly in the US and UK contexts.
I want to talk about the colonial aspect in just a second, but let's talk about why the landings in Provence are overlooked. You're a professor in university. I studied at university, and I've spoken to a lot of colleagues as well. Nobody knew about these landings in D-Day, and I'm not just talking about Anglophones. I also spoke to a colleague of mine who's working in French today and asked if she learned about the landings in Provence in school, and they don't learn a whole lot about it here in France either. Why is that?
I think primarily this is down to the fact that the D-Day June 1944 landings were so significant and so substantial in terms of their nature. It was the largest amphibian landing of any kind in history. And as a result, the kind of Provence landings have been overshadowed simply because of the scale of the D-Day landings. And I think it's also partly because the Allied forces were victorious very quickly. In August 1944, they pushed the Nazis back way north in France, way beyond Dijon, and then eventually back into German-controlled territory. So, because of this sort of scale of suffering, as it were, the scale of losses weren't anywhere as significant as they were in Normandy. I think this is also one of the reasons why this landing has been generally overlooked, as well as I was saying before, because of that wider question around the involvement of colonial forces and North African, Sub-Saharan African soldiers in particular.
Now, of course, Emmanuel Macron paid special tribute to the sacrifices made of those soldiers who came from former French colonies. But the truth of the matter is that today in 2024, France's relationship with its former colonies is markedly different than it was even 10 years ago.
And that's absolutely right. And of course, this is a kind of ongoing legacy, really, isn't it? We think about how France has approached its former colonies, particularly in Africa, which is the subject really of today around the involvement of African soldiers. That relationship between France and particularly Sub-Saharan Africa has evolved gradually. Previously, particularly under Jacques Chirac, there's a whole kind of project of La France-Afrique, the idea of ever closer relations between France and former African colonies. But the relationship with Algeria has also evolved substantially. Particularly post the Algerian War of Independence, there was a period of near total kind of ignorance of one another, really, and a lack of involvement and cooperation. More recently, there's been increasing cooperation between France and Algeria, and indeed the wider territories across North Africa that were once French colonies. So it's an ongoing kind of project, an ongoing legacy. But of course, there are moments where particular world events or other kind of events create further tension. But by and large, I'd say this is another opportunity for France and for Macron in particular to be able to demonstrate the thanks of the French people towards these young men, mainly, who came from North and Sub-Saharan Africa with a view of kind of liberating what was then called la mère patrie, the kind of motherland.
But they were conscripted, weren't they? And earlier today we had Paul Biya, the president of Cameroon, who spoke about the defense of freedoms, what have you. But this is a man who's been in power for decades.
There was very little choice and very little agency, I think it's fair to say, for many of the young men involved in the Provence landings. And indeed, these young men, of course, went on to liberate the whole of France and then to invade Germany. I think certainly it's true that actually in terms of that kind of opportunity for democracy and for freedom, there was an element during the just before the Provence landings in 1944 where there seemed to be a promise on the part of de Gaulle, Charles de Gaulle, the then leader of the provisional French government, that these people would have independence, and that never really emerged. And of course, as a result, there were a series of somewhat bloody colonial wars across Africa.
David Lee, so a final question. Why was there this concerted effort made by Charles de Gaulle to sort of whitewash the contributions made of these soldiers in particular when it comes to soldiers that were coming from former colonies, from colonies at the time?
Well, I mean, put very simply, Charles de Gaulle thrived on very simple myths. So the idea that France as a whole never collaborated with the Nazis, that was the Vichy government, that wasn't a legal regime. The idea that everyone in France resisted the Nazis. So this is a simple kind of narrative. The idea that everyone who was involved in the Free French forces was white, they weren't part of this kind of North African or Sub-Saharan African colonial army, and it made it much simpler when it came to the idea of French control over African territories. It's kind of a question of simplicity around the myth of Charles de Gaulle, which is why he developed that narrative.
Interesting point. David Lees, thank you very much for joining us on the program today.